New this week from DC Comics, Jenny Sparks, issue number 1, written by Tom King, art by Jeff Spokes. The latest premier Black Label series from renowned game-changing author Tom King is a bit of a conundrum. If you've been watching this channel for some time, then you know that my reviews are primarily positive in the hopes of recommending new and exciting comics to you, the viewer. However, this review is going to be a little bit different, it's going to be a little bit meandering, but I promise you, I have a larger point to make. First and foremost, this new series features a character that is relatively obscure in modern comics, having only been featured in a few key comics from the late 1990s and early 2000s, predominantly as a member of the Authority, which is essentially a team adjacent to something like the Justice League. Though the series was remounted in 2008 for a 4th volume, that is still over 15 years since this character has seen relevance. Which leads us to our first deep dive question of the mercurial nature of comic book readership. You may be asking, why Jenny Sparks? Why now? Why Tom King? Who is this series directed towards? The most immediate answer to these questions is that with James Gunn's announced plan to adapt the Authority and the future of DC films, it makes sense for DC Comics to reintroduce these characters to their audience base sooner rather than later. However, this is not as easy as it sounds on paper. Reviving a character from nearly 2 decades ago in the modern, shifting, changing landscape of DC Comics, especially a character whose very essence is tied to the 20th century when we're well on our way into the 21st. Given some of these intellectual hurdles, it makes all the sense in the world then, from an editorial perspective, to entrust the future of the character with a seasoned writer like Tom King, who fans know and love, and most essentially, trust. But is such an assignment a service to Tom King and his eclectic fan base? Or is Jenny Sparks perhaps an indication of the oversaturation of Tom King's narrative styling? And after reading the first issue, I would unfortunately argue the latter. I attribute this pervading disillusionment with a few key factors, the first of which being that I read comics week to week, and I've been a consistent Tom King subscriber for at least the last 5 years, which means I am well aware of Tom King's narrative predilection for a flawed, blunt, foul-mouthed, more force of nature than mortal female protagonist, which describes a major element of a handful of his most recent books, Supergirl Woman of Tomorrow, Helen of Windhorn, Penguin, even Rorschach, which I want to stress isn't a bad thing because all of those are excellent, unique, diverse books in their own right, and specific catch-all comparisons like that rarely do any story justice. However, I have to mention it because it definitely contributes to the pervading unconscious sentiment that I and many comic fans may be feeling with this issue, that Jenny Sparks feels like just another Tom King story, rather than giving it the impartial reading it deserves. Which is a shame because, as a rule, I want to champion new characters and new stories. A cool, vacillating, perspective-shifting narrative would normally be a virtue, familiar, rewarding component of picking up the latest Tom King title. I can't help but feel wary, maybe burnt out at the tedious pace and gradually unfolding narrative of the first issue of Jenny Sparks. However, that is my incredibly biased opinion as a mass consumer hobbyist of print comics, which I suppose leads me into my penultimate point. Thank you so much for sticking around this long, you're a real one. The audience is a fickle beast, which means that the task of appealing to them is monumental, even for companies like DC and Marvel. So while choosing Tom King to launch this new vision may seem like a good idea, I would argue that choosing a specific writer like King for this story sends more of a message to those in the know than those that are uninitiated, and may only end up alienating fans with more of the same. I think it's difficult for diehard fans, especially reviewers like myself, to separate themselves from the zeitgeist of modern comic releases and imagine themselves as just a casual fan picking up this comic and reading it for the first time. It's just difficult for me to imagine somebody doing that for Jenny Sparks. I mean, there's a lot of information that you need to know about this character, and I didn't know, and I was on Wikipedia like 6 times. I also want to admit here that it feels ridiculous for me to say there's too many Tom King comics, because I have enjoyed far more of his works than I disliked, and even an objectively middling Tom King comic is better than most comics on the market, let's be real. I told you, it's a conundrum. I don't know what to think. I think now, more than ever, the comic book community as a collective will just have to decide for themselves what to make of this. But let's talk more specifically about the story of Jenny Sparks issue number 1, which means spoilers ahead. Our story begins with Jenny Sparks and her one-night stand being rudely awakened by the early morning arrival of Batman, which is an image that I wouldn't wish on anyone. Then cut back and forth between various innocuous scenes with seemingly random characters in typical Tom King fashion, as our big picture begins to slowly unfold. The crisis at the heart of our story, however, is Captain Atom is loose in Los Angeles, clearly mentally unstable, wreaking wanton, random violence on innocent people. After rousing her from bed, Batman explains to Jenny that Clark, which is a really interesting detail that he says Clark and not Superman, is having trouble locating Captain Atom in the city because of the radiation that he gives off. And Wonder Woman is on Paradise Island on standby, so they need her help. The reasoning for this isn't immediately obvious and only vaguely clarified in the next scene, where Jenny arrives at the crime scene and absorbs the lingering energy of Captain Atom in order to locate his energy signature. We then cut to Captain Atom as he gallivants around town, accosting a local homeless man who just wants to feed his pigeons and doesn't have time for this weird shit, which honestly is super respectable. The climax of this issue sees Jenny confronting Captain Atom as a showdown between competing forces of energy, which is rendered dramatically by artist Jeff Spokes, but the really interesting part of this scene is Jenny insinuating that she has a responsibility to overlook all of superherodom. And I really hope that that aspect of her character, her divine mission as a spirit of a century, can be clarified by Tom King in a more tangible way. As Jenny electrocutes and anecdotally monologues to the wounded Captain Atom, she is caught off guard and ultimately killed by Captain Atom's grip, which is a genuinely shocking development. The issue then culminates in classic Tom King fashion, with all of our random citizen plot lines converging at one bar on one fateful night as Captain Atom walks in the door. We also see Batman checking on Jenny at the morgue, explaining to the doctor that she isn't exactly a normal woman, she's 124 years old. I think that it's interesting that Batman is our main point of introduction and contact with Jenny Sparks, because she seems precisely like the kind of entity that Bruce would hate because he just can't understand it. And I wonder if he's going to be included in future issues, or if the ultimate scope of this series is the reintroduction of the cast of the Authority. Similar to how Danger Street is secretly a New Gods and Outsiders story. It's too early to say and difficult to speculate on because this first issue ends with a continuation with the recently revived Jenny arriving at the bar to presumably save the hostages within from Captain Atom's crazed outbursts. In the end of this issue, I don't feel particularly left with a sense of what a Jenny Sparks story is like. But I am definitely intrigued by the many facets of her character. This electricity-wielding, energy-sensing, badass, chain-smoking, confident, eternal soul of a woman who commands the respect of heroes from the highest echelon of the DC Comics universe. Classic Tom King fashion, I suppose fans will have to wait and see to determine if the overall narrative is an emotionally impactful and cohesive one, as long as they are inclined to wait. Please support your local comic book store and pick up Jenny Sparks issue number 1 on shelves now. I really like the simplicity of this first page. It feels kind of iconic, and I enjoy that the message here really starts to resonate the more you read the comic. POV, you're Alex. You wake up in a strange hotel room. You're naked. Batman's here. Batman's here and you're naked. This is about where I had to start looking things up. I was like, why is she talking about Adolf Hitler? Oh, she has electricity powers? Or is it energy powers? Is it radiation? Is it electricity? What is it? How old is she? What's going on?